The Strait of Bonifacio is a place of danger for shipping, where so many lives have been shattered. Bonifacio is the very tip of the nation, the end of French territory. This extremity of Corsica was for centuries the military centre facing Sardinia, a citadel forming the border with the other Mediterranean world. Bonifacio is above all the most beautiful natural port in the whole of the Mediterranean. With fortifications right up to the end of the peninsula, Bonifacio was a fortified outpost, with areas that were entirely annexed to the military. In the 1970s, this region was once again united with the creation of a marine reserve between Corsica and Sardinia for the protection of biodiversity. The jewel of this nature reserve in the Strait of Bonifacio is the Lavezzi Archipelago, a conservatory for fauna and flora specific to the Mediterranean.
If you have to sum up the richness of the Lavezzi, it would be difficult. It's a landscape, a particular geological formation that some people think is a bit like Brittany. It's a well of biodiversity, both in the riches of its flowers on the land and the riches of its birds, particularly its seabirds.
These Coris shearwaters that wail like infants nest at night under the jumble of rocks. The little albatross lands here to reproduce before returning to spend the winter at sea off the coasts of Africa. For 35 years, ornithologists from the nature reserve have monitored this bird using rings and GLS recorders, which have given them precious knowledge of this great traveller.
Write down the GLS number. In October, the birds will leave, totally instinctively. All the birds in the nest around us will move towards the sea and all fly away. With a beat of their wings, they'll all fly off across to Gibraltar. We have some extraordinary data. One bird with a sensor was tracked every 48 hours. It stopped in the Balearics, and actually it waited for a depression to get a push past Gibraltar, and it ended up in the south of Morocco 48 hours later. We say thank you for what it's done for science. It's a poetic symbol, a symbol which intoxicates sailors, a symbol which is something quite exceptional, and is part of our heritage. It's also a very good indicator of the state of health of the sea and of the wildlife on these islands.
Greater flamingos come from Sardinia, the Camargue, or from Turkey to spend the winter on the lagoons on Corsica's eastern plain. With over 20,000 birds, Bigoulia Lagoon is the third most important lake in France by number of birds. This coastal land has a long history, and the wildlife here reflects that. About 30 years ago, Francis Leandri and Fabienne Maestrach set about reopening the coastal trail that was used for centuries between Campororo and Beneficio. They took over a decade to uncover the trail that was paved in part by the Romans. They brought up to date a part of Corsica's history which was written here, on this coastline, which is now an emblem of the wild natural environment.
When Francis started bringing his first clients here, there was very little remaining of the coastal trails. There were a few hunters' trails or those of people who had animals and took them from one place to another. But the first time we left Propriano to go to Bonifacio, it was a wild gamble, absolutely wild. There were hardly any clues. Unlike what you might think, the Corsicans are people of the mountains, etc. But there's a whole part of Corsica which was oriented towards a maritime way of life and maritime routes. So very often, goods were transported by sea. Corsica was a garden, you must understand that. It was a garden that started at Bonifacio and ended up at the Cap Corse. And all these trails that we see were made in order to transport goods, and not only people, goods or animals. And now they've become a sort of emblem of the natural environment. But if the Corsicans of not even a century ago came back and heard that, it would be a terrible humiliation for them. It would mean they weren't able to maintain their land. I'm a farmer. The maquis is my #1 enemy. When I see this, after the aesthetic emotion, I feel a great regret, because it means there are no more humans to occupy the space. The wilderness is beautiful, but we must also have our place here.
After 2 world wars, Corsica's population was so depleted that it became a holiday destination. The French state decided to develop the island's economy through its main resource, its natural capital. Major projects for tourist development first of all targeted the most exceptional natural sites. On the Sanguinaires archipelago, the Gulf of Porto, on the tip of Cap Corse, promoters dreamt up the craziest projects. A pleasure port, a heliport, a casino, hotels with over 15,000 beds. Here in this little corner of nature, a concrete jetty was once built to receive the residents of about 100 villas that a promoter wanted to build. He had already marked out the roads and access routes when one day his project was stopped dead.
When he quietly built his house, no one bothered him. But when he decided to build a very big development, that was when he started having problems.
It's not that I'm against people building in Corsica, but there are places to build and places to dream, and I think this is a place to dream. People have been fighting for Corsica for centuries. The first Corsican revolts don't go back to Pascal Paoli. The resistance has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years in Corsica. And the last members of the resistance are the people who fought and paid with years in prison, and sometimes with their life, to maintain these spaces. These landscapes that we see now are magnificent. These 3 days that we spend by the sea, it's because people paid with their life and their freedom that we can offer you that privilege. If those people hadn't existed, there would probably be a major crossroads here, probably a Leclerc, casino or Carrefour supermarket, cafes. There would be people everywhere, police, cars, fire engines, because people would have car crashes. Do you understand? And at some point, Corsicans committed themselves so that would not happen here. But for me, someone who fights for their land is a man and a real Corsican.
How do you reconcile nature and tourism on such a fragile island? How can it be developed without losing its soul and without damaging the landscape? Today, the coastline is at the heart of all the questions being asked about Corsica.